started. So welcome back. Well, welcome back to USM, or welcome to USM, especially for everybody. But if you're new to USM, it would be great to say hi. And we can do that after class or anytime. And if you're coming back, it'd also be great to say hi. I only know a couple of students in here, which is interesting because, who are you? What are you up to like that? And my name's Champlin. This is BIO305. And the first thing is just to mention that if you are in, some of you are in the lab course, and we're going to meet Thursday afternoon for about an hour. So I'll already posted that on Brightspace, and I'll post a reminder. But we'll just get started and kind of get organized this week and then dive into it next week. All right, so this course is a great big topic. Developmental biology historically was called embryology. When I was in college, I took a course called embryology. And that topic has been around forever, right? What's going on with embryos? Where did we come from? Where did anything come from? And how did it form? And so people have wondered about that, for thousands of years. It's called developmental biology now because 40 years ago, there was a dramatic change in the field. And up to that point, biologists, scientists really didn't have a good handle on embryology. And then finally, tools of molecular genetics and biochemistry were developed to the degree that it could be used to analyze embryos, and people found out a lot fast. And what they found out is just stunning. Like that, so the entire field has changed. It's also called developmental biology because it's no longer limited to embryos. It covers the whole life cycle of multicellular plants and animals. Our course is going to be almost entirely about animals, rather. There's just one chapter in our textbook about plants. And when we cover that, it'll really be a compare and contrast between what we were learning about animals and what is going on with plants. And the reason for that is because the last common ancestor between plants and animals was a single-celled eukaryote. So after that divergence of that last common ancestor, plants invented multicellularity independently of animals. And so it's a rare opportunity on our planet to compare and contrast two different versions of development, because development is always about multicellular organisms. And it's fascinating because what we'll learn a lot about in our course is the development of animals is all really astonishingly similar. And we know that from analyzing the organisms and looking at their DNA. And then it's also true about plants. The development of all plants on our planet is shockingly similar. Every flower of every plant you'll ever see is really built with the same strategy. Like that. So it's just fascinating. It's a gigantic topic. We could start anywhere, and you'll see our author in the first chapter wanders around. And we have to spend a couple of weeks wandering around just to set the stage for this, because none of you have really heard anything about this, because so much of it is new. So other professors were trained, like me, back when it was embryology, and it was kind of the backwaters of biology. And so those professors have learned more, but they're not experts in the topic. And so there are very few examples of developmental biology that get taught in other areas in biology courses. Like in introbio, the examples are hemoglobin. Well, that's a physiological story. That's how's your body doing right now. And there's a lot understood about physiology and a lot of courses, right? There are a lot of courses that you could take in physiology like that. So we can start anywhere, and we'll start here in a barbershop, and you're getting your hair cut, and you stand up, and somebody points at the floor and says, "What's that?" And you say, "Well, that's my hair." And they say, where did it come from? And there are a variety of verbs you could use. You could say, I grew it, or synthesized it, or assembled it, but your hair was not here, and there it is, right? It's not like it was all coiled up in your head and came squinching out. It wasn't here. And it's built from a variety of metabolic, precursors like that, but it's a new thing. The metabolic precursors that used to build that hair, they could have been all plants. You could have been vegetarian, and you didn't eat any hair in your diet, but there's hair, right? So it's something new like that. And you could point to your heart, and your heart is the same story as your hair. It was not here, and you built it. It's a little deceptive because we developed in our mom's tummy, but it was the genetic information that we inherited from mom and dad that was used to build your heart and every other body part in the same way that your hair was just not here, like that. And people, this is a gigantic story in human existence, right? People wonder about what happens after we die. They also wonder about, well, where did you come from? And the answer is, you're new. You're just new. And this is all about that. It's all about us. But because we're so similar to other animals, you'll see lots of examples we use are on simpler model organisms. They can be studied rapidly and then the understanding applied to our bodies like that, right? Okay, so the term is called epigenesis. And genesis means new and epi means a phenomenon. And so development of all animals on our planet is through this epigenesis, and all animals and plants form new. They're new. That's different than the idea that, maybe your hair was already here and it's just getting squeezed out of your head like it's some fancy, haircut Barbie doll that already had the hair in it. It's not like that at all. The term looks a lot like a term that's very common now, epigenetics, but they're different terms. And we'll learn about the term epigenetics as well. But epigenesis is just our first term, built new, like that. And the next thing is it stands in contrast to the other term, which is called preformation. If your hair was already curled up in your head and it just came pushing out, that's preformation. And historically, ancient people like Aristotle thought, yeah, maybe it's new. But that was really old, and that was just an idea. Because beyond that, really ancient times, there was a huge chunk of human history where folks were very confident that we were preformed. What's an example of that? The first people that looked at sperm under a microscope could see the little person inside that head of the sperm driving the sperm. And they drew it. And that's preformation. The person was there, and again, this is a giant topic, but the person better be there because their soul better be there. Right? Like that. And that was the understanding for a really long time in human history, is preformation. And it existed during the time when people believed in spontaneous generation and other things they just didn't understand. Spontaneous generation is where life just is produced. Of course, the people that drew those pictures of sperm with little drivers were all guys, right? Because it was just an incredibly sexist topic. And, it turns out that it's just really flawed. That at the time, people thought, the sperm carries the person, and the female is just nourishment. In about 1800, the first person on Earth saw a mammalian egg, and he had been looking for it for a long time, using microscopes that weren't that great. And he had to look for it because mammalian eggs are really little, because the embryo is carried internally. And that's in contrast to all of our vertebrate relatives. Birds, reptiles, amphibian, fish have big eggs because they have external development. So mom produces a lot of nourishment. And so when this guy in Germany that we'll talk a little bit about saw this egg. He just got up and walked out and just walked around town going, oh my God. Because it was really a shocking discovery to think that the female actually contributed to the baby like that. So people refer to that as a spermocentric universe, and it was really flawed like that. So again, this is just a gigantic field that really transforms humans' understanding of who we are and how we fit in. You know that a microscope is built with magnifying lenses, and so are telescopes. And you know that back in the 1600s and 1700s, when people first looked in telescopes, it really transformed our understanding of how we fit in. The same happened with microscopes in the 1800s. When scientists started looking at embryos, they saw really similar relationships between them. And so, up until then, the folks really had no clue and believed in this preformation and believed in a really big role for the male. That's why I put this crown here, because you know, famously, royal lineages run through the male, right? The queen is just there for nourishment, but it's that king that's gonna have the, you know, the heirs, like that, right? So lots of human history is built on this misunderstanding of, you know, fundamental biology that starts our course, right? So we can kind of mark it out. So the 1700s, there was this, and there really weren't scientists hardly then. They were really philosophers who were trying to make observations of the natural world. So it was just a small number of people, and they were just making little steps. And that was true in the 1800s too. So about 200 years ago is when some scientists, a small number of them, really looked at embryos under a microscope, and what they did is they described them. And so there are lots of terms that we're going to learn in our course that are from this descriptive embryology. Here's an example. Vertebrates are also chordates, and in whatever we are, family or something like that, we're not vertebrates, we're chordata. And we're in that category because the early embryos of all vertebrates have a tissue that we'll learn about. I won't write it down right now because we'll get to it. It's called the notochord, and that's why we're chordates. And that's a more fundamental organizational feature of vertebrates than anything else. We'll learn that the notochord is just kind of a transient tissue. That's sort of where our backbone is. And what it's famous for is it's going to induce the formation of our central nervous system, our brain and our spinal cord, which all vertebrates have and which, you know, we're really particularly proud of, like that. So there'll be these descriptive embryology terms we'll use. Now, we'll get to those sort of at the end of the second week, because the flow of our course is going to be, we'll read our first chapter, and our first chapter is just ranging, like, you know, introduction to some of the different features of the course. And then we're going to jump to the sixth chapter to talk a little bit about kind of the nuts and bolts of an example of a simple organism, a nematode, that was used to do some Nobel Prize-winning discoveries in the 1990s, where the scientists learned about these little worms using a genetic approach. And then it turned out, oh, the same is true for humans, like that. And so they won Nobel Prizes in medicine, like that. And then we'll go back and we skip chapter 2. Chapter 2 is about fruit flies. We won't cover that until after the first exam. So we go to chapter 1, we jump into a little piece of chapter 6, and then we go to chapter 3, 4, 5. And 3, 4, 5 are setting up the body axes of all vertebrates. So it's all very much the same, and we're talking about setting up the head to tail, the anterior posterior, and the back to front dorsal ventral, the side to side bilateral axes of all vertebrates. So very early embryos. And we start out in different situations, right? A great big chicken egg or a little tiny human egg. And that affects how the embryo starts to develop. But all vertebrate embryos, will learn, converge on a common body structure very early, before there are any limbs or bones or organs, and it's a common structure because of our evolutionary relationship, like that. And it's based on something that we'll dive into really soon, and that is, it's based on the genes that regulate that. And people refer to those as a genetic toolkit, because we'll learn that the genes are common in all animals because they're like screwdrivers and wrenches. And you can have a toolkit with screwdrivers and wrenches, and you can put together all kinds of different stuff. And that's what those developmental regulators do, and they did that for about 800 million years. And they did it in our common ancestor that was back then, a little tiny worm, and they keep playing that role because it turns out with a set of tools, you can put together a huge diversity of organisms. And, you know, I mentioned Aristotle, but there are 0 people who thought that until 50 years ago, that there was a common genetic toolkit that assembles all animals. And so we'll learn the names of some of the genes. One of them is called Wnt, W-N-T. Another is called sonic hedgehog. So they have names that you've never heard of, but the significance of Wnt in animals on our planet is way, way, way bigger than hemoglobin or insulin, like that, because it's common in all animals, like that. So that's descriptive embryology, and you know, I'm not really into the history of science, but it's just that that's when these people just named all these body parts like that. Like we have a body cavity that's called a coelomic cavity. That forms in a common way in all embryos of all vertebrates, like that. So descriptive embryology, things are going slow. It was until about 1900 where scientists did some experiments. So they would transplant cells between embryos, or they might tag a cell in an embryo and see what happened to it, like that. Really pretty simple experiments, but elegant experiments. And we'll only talk about a couple of them. The book talks about them in the first chapter, like that, because they were so insightful and so indicative of the story. But then, during the 20th century, the 1900s, embryology just fell by the wayside. It's a hugely important field of biology, but they just didn't have the tools to find out, you know, well, what are those molecular factors until, you know, genetics and biochemistry really developed, right? Because genetics and biochemistry both formed in 1900, like about then, you know, so they were taking the time to build up. And they tackled problems and challenges like the genetics of hemoglobin, because there's a lot of physiological stories that are relevant for our health, right? Like that. Nowadays, developmental biology is roaring forward because so much of our health is dependent on developmental stories. All of cancer biology is a story of development gone wrong, right? So that, you know, that's just driving it forward. And a lot of stories of like regenerative medicine and stem cell biology, that's all developmental biology. And it's not a biomedical course, but we're setting the stage for all that because all animals have really similar stories like that. Yep, okay? And so we'll go like that. And again, it's not a history course, but it really helps to kind of appreciate just how big a ramp we're going up in this course topic like that, okay? So what is developmental biology? And this is another good example. You know, should we start our course? Well, one is epigenesis. You got Bill New, epigenesis. Here's another one. So here's a zebra getting away from a lion. And I just love this picture, right? Because we know zebras could run really fast. They're going to run away from the predator. But look at it, it's also just kicking, you know, like that, right? And so, right, Charles Darwin was right on target. We see evolution through natural selection. The fossils of zebras and other horse ancestors had really short legs. And so through natural selection, survival of the fittest, they evolved these long legs to get away from predators, like that, right? Super famous, super comfortable, super correct logic. Here's the deal. the story here is really about the development of the legs. That's what's changed. And people didn't understand that. In Origin of the Species, right? So Origin of the Species, Darwin wrote here in the mid-1800s. And he wrote, he said, there's the embryos are really important, but I don't know how to fit those in. And the answer is, oh, well, a big story in evolution is that we look different, right? A dolphin has its nose on top of its head. But if you look at an early dolphin embryo, the nose is right here. And the story of the return to the ocean by mammals involved a lot of changes in the development of the bones of the skull, where there was different rates of growth. But it was still development of the bones of the skull. It was just tweaking those developmental pathways. And so this is a really good example of that, where you're like, oh, the bones in the zebras, like they're the same bones as the ancestral horse, they just grow at different rates. So the story of the evolution of the leg is a story of development, like that. We think about evolution as occurring, that natural selection occurring a lot at the mature organism level, right? Look at that adult zebra, get away, right? And natural selection, right? So it's happening on the product of development, but it's a lot of changes like that. And so we can think about it this way. So Darwin wrote Survival of the Fittest, and what he was writing about, he was really saying something about the environment or the ecology, the niche that the organism lives in, and then the fittest, he's referring to the physiology. So there are two important things there. We already mentioned physiology and now also ecology, but it's not mentioning development. So I always teach this, and I say, and again, none of the other, like if you ask some other biology professor, what are the 3 legs of biology? Nobody would give you these 3 legs. But it's very satisfying to use this analogy and say the 3 legs are, you can start here. Oh, this is just a little bit, come on. So one of these legs, so this is all of biology, it's a 3-legged stool. And one leg is physiology. And really the bottom line is physiology means what it's like to be alive. Every cell has cellular physiology, and then we have tissue, organ, and organismal physiology. But every bacterial cell has physiology. It's called cellular physiology, and it's alive. And physiology occurs in life, and then when the organism dies, the physiology stops. So physiology is like a biochemical phenomenon. And it's about how the cell is doing or how you're doing. How's your heart, how's your brain, how's that working? You know, like that. And that's a huge, huge thing. And so just imagine just how big that is. And it's all about the organism. And even when it's a single cell organism. And then we're going to focus on this. And development, it turns out, is just as big a leg. It's just a huge, huge chunk of biology. And that's about how the organism got to put together. So we don't think of bacteria as undergoing development, although there's some examples of kind of precursor-like development in bacteria that we'll talk a little bit about. But really it's multicellular plants and animals that go through the development we're talking about. And when you talk about this, those 2 legs, what those are doing is they're explaining everything that ever happens inside a living thing. And there's a lot of overlap, and so we want to be careful not to be like, oh, it's physiology or development. Those are the big topics inside the organism. How are you doing right now, and how'd you get here? Like that, yep. And they're really both just gigantic, like that. And then this 3rd leg is ecology. And that's the organism and its environment, the relationship between the organism and its environment. One reason I like this model is you can see something here that's really dramatic, and that is the development leg was really thin and spindly until about 1985. And in the 20th century, I already mentioned physiology was exploding. Genetics and biochemistry of hemoglobin and insulin and the circulatory system and all this stuff, hormones, blah, blah, blah. And ecology too. Scientists making a lot of great discoveries. So, in 1980, and nobody talked about this, nobody really perceived it, the entire field of biology was wobbly. And you might say, where does ecology fit in this? And the answer is, it's the table. It's all the examples of everything ever that's alive is a story of evolution. And so the theory of evolution was wobbly. There was a piece missing. And we can talk about that some, but it's significant because people were like, yeah, I don't know if I believe in evolution, like that. And no biologist would have perceived that or admitted it, but there was actually a good reason why, and it's because the field was wobbly. There was a piece that was weak, like that. And it's very different now, like that. Yeah, so it's a cool and interesting analogy because, right, Darwin focused on natural selection, survival of the fittest, survival in the environment of the fittest physiology, and there's nothing about the embryogenesis and development of the organism. So it's really interesting to see that, and just, on the first day of our course, to sort of appreciate that. Darwin realized that there was a piece missing. He wrote about embryos, and he's like, well, I just can't fit that in, and it's very understandable. He had this profound insight, and the fact that it didn't loop in embryos is okay. Nothing wrong, no criticism of the evolution. It was just weak because it didn't explain things sufficiently well to have that nice balanced table. So another thing, just before we leave this, it's interesting to see is that, since we're going to talk about this, because you can take other classes in biology, right? You can take a course in genetics. And we put genetics over here because genetics always involves examples of those three things. And cell biology, molecular biology, biochemistry, they're off to the side and they're looking at the table like that. Evolution, anytime you try to explain that, that's great. It's really hard to teach genetics because you want to talk about immunology, that's part of this, physiology or development of the immune system, but you got to go into that topic. And so the professor has to explain in a genetics class some features of the immune system, like that, or some features of vision to talk about mutations, right? Features of hemoglobin. The hemoglobin gene gets mutated, so it's not going to perform properly in the red blood cells in transporting oxygen, right? You got to explain that to give the example. So I have a set of topics in here, genomics and big bio data science nowadays. It's off to the side, and they're fantastic, but they're really used to tackle that. Then we have other fields like immunology. That's off to the side here. Special focus on the physiology of development. Or ornithology, study of birds. Well, you can talk about the physiology and development of birds, right? And you're welcome to talk about the specialized topic. So there are lots of other topics in biology, but they all are arrayed around this table. This would be like a table, and reach into it for examples. A really key thing is to appreciate that evolution is the fiber, the wood, the actual structure, the material of the table. There's just it's impossible to talk about an example of biology without talking about evolution. And so it turns out that this leg was thin, so we didn't really understand development, and we didn't understand it in the context of evolution, like that example of the zebra's leg. And there's been such a dramatic contribution that there's a special term that scientists use. They refer to something called evo-devo, and evo-devo is the evolution of developmental mechanisms, like how do bones form and grow. Once you have a developmental mechanism for a bone to form and grow, you can have mutations that will adjust that and make it different somewhat, and you can get all the different bones. I mentioned the zebra's leg, and you probably know that every vertebrate limb, whether it's a leg or an arm or a wing, they have the same bones. It's just a question of tweaking the development. And that's true not just for the bones, but the other tissues in the limbs have just been adjusted, right? They all have muscles and tendons and nerves and blood vessels and skin, right? And there have just been developmental adjustments in those, and that's called evo-devo. And our textbook is just 100% evo-devo because you can't escape evolution. I couldn't give you an example that we could learn about that wasn't an example of evolution. And so we'll talk about it out through. It turns out our course has evo-devo as a final chapter because there's a lot that gets stacked up and it becomes a very advanced topic. But, and we actually won't get to that chapter, but we'll be talking evo-devo the whole time. We'll talk about that evolution story a lot, all the way through it. And so that's a big core part of our course is evo-devo and that contribution like that. And on our syllabus, there's just this little sea squirt, little tiny organism that lives in the ocean. And I included a picture of it because I included just an excerpt of a term paper a student wrote several years ago. And this student just happened to be a really good writer. So, you know, you don't have to worry about that. They went on to law school and got a free 100% tuition ride through law school at Northeastern in Boston. You know, they're just really good writers like that and wanted to be a science writer and use like law and science and write and work on that, right? But they write about is the genes that regulate the development of that. That organism does not have hair, bones, heart, you know, any muscles, anything. But it's got that freaking Wnt gene that's regulating its body axis. It doesn't have an anterior and posterior, but it does have a body axis. It has a head and a foot. That's not anterior and posterior, right? It has radial symmetry. It's so different than us. But the last common ancestor between and us was already a multicellular, like the multicellular organism, animal. And so we have some shared features in our development like that. Just crazy. And that student's writing about it. So I included that. Next thing is, that's a little bit of our syllabus, and I'm not handing the syllabus out. So the syllabus is posted on Brightspace. Let me show you that right here. So on Brightspace, if you go under content, hold down menu, click on syllabus, our syllabus is there. Then I made a video explaining the syllabus. So we're not spending time in doing that. That's really important. How you get graded, what your expectations are, learning outcomes, so forth like that. I made I don't know how long it is, 15 or 20 minutes, and just go watch that the first week of course so you know what's going on. And I'm super focused on your grades and, you know, the structure of the course. But, you know, let's just put it out there so you have it throughout the semester to look back to both the syllabus physically and also my explanation of it, like that. So look at that, right, like that. And as you're doing any of that, write down questions, confusion, bring them to class, you know, ask, you know, just because if you have questions or confusion, other people will too, right? So it's really good. You can, of course, email me or we can meet and stuff like that, but just bring it up in class like that, okay? So the syllabus is there, and we're not going to talk about it very much in class, but we can as much as you want. So, and I'm never going to hand stuff out, right? I'm just going to be posting it on Brightspace. And I already started doing that. And what I do mostly on Brightspace is I post these announcements. And when I make an announcement, you get an email notification of the announcement like that. And I number them. So we had number 1, get the book. Number 2, we're going to have some quizzes a week from today and 2 weeks from today. And they're based on some videos that are, the links are in the second announcement. Third announcement, here's the syllabus, and I made a video of it, like that, right? So we'll just go through that, and you'll see that. And I don't use Brightspace very much. I've never taught an online course, so I don't even use the Brightspace gradebook. I usually just do, like, put some handouts on there and do these announcements like that. And so this course is really an in-person course, like that. All right, so here's something I always try to show at the first of every week, and that is what should you be doing? It's week 1. So you should read chapter 1, and it's going to take us a long time get through chapter 1. What is going on in chapter 1? Here's the deal with chapter 1. I already mentioned you can think of Wint and Sonic Hedgehog and Hox Jeans and on and on. You can think of those as tools in a toolkit, and you can think of this course as a course on car mechanics, where you're taking a course to learn about how to be a car mechanic, and the author of the book is really old. He lives in England. He's really old. He's really nice, Lewis Wolpert. And he's like an old-time car mechanic who was already grown up when this big explosion of discovery in developmental biology occurred. So he's lived it, right? He's very old and wise from that. He picked embryology when it was a stupid loser thing to pick. He really likes embryology, right? So what's the first chapter like? And it's like this. Imagine that we're in a course on car mechanics, and he's this old guy, right? Crusty old guy who knows all about cars. Take us outside. Get up and go outside. And out in the parking lot are a whole bunch of different kinds of vehicles, including a lawnmower, which is like a fruit fly. And he goes over the lawnmower and he flips it over and he says, look at this blade and how it spins around. That's a really common thing. That's an axle. It's pretty memorable, huh? The blade is spinning in a circle because of that axle, right? And then he goes, see that car? That's the human body. We're interested in that. Axle, axle, axle. Yeah, and this I've never taught in this classroom.